Well, welcome everybody to another session of the 14th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Ailes, and you're stuck with me as the moderator for the sessions. As a reminder, all of our sessions are closed caption. View the captions, simply click on the closed caption icon on the bottom of the toolbar. In addition, the recordings of each session are available usually within an hour after the conclusion of each day. Um, also, don't forget, all attendees have access to the library of session recordings from the past 13 years. It numbers about 600. Um, all you have to do to access that, you'll see on our website up at the top menu, I've added a cleverly named link called Sessions Library. So today we have with us Linda Smith, who's going to tell us the important things we need to know about copyright. Take it away, Linda.
Hey, thank you, Bob. Let's switch over to my screen. I hope everyone can see the screen here now. And I'm going to turn off my video. So, what does copyright mean for online teachers and students today? Here's what we're going to talk about and how we're going to proceed on this session. We're going to go through why it's important to understand copyright details today, not just the general idea of how do we make sure we're within the legal guidelines, but also there's more details we need to be aware of. We'll go over some copyright basics. We'll look at the usage restrictions spectrum. Then we'll do some knowledge checks where I will post a question about a copyright issue with an example on the screen, and then we'd really like to have some audience participation. So please feel free to join in either with your microphone or in the chat, and give us your comments on what you think about the answer for our knowledge check questions. Then we're going to define fair use today. And finally, protecting your intellectual property, whether you're a teacher or a student. So the internet has had a big impact on copyright issues today. There are so many more opportunities, intentional or not intentional, to violate someone's copyrights. Protecting intellectual property, respecting intellectual property requires us to be aware of what we're doing in a much finer level of detail than if we were in a teaching environment. Fair use assumed that we could use almost anything as long as it were limited to our classroom setting and sharing with students for educational purposes. Now, with so much being done online, whether it's an entire course or whether it's just shared resources that a face-to-face classroom uses, we have to be much more aware of what that translates to in other people having access beyond our fair use boundaries within a physical classroom. So our new technologies and expanded access bring both benefits and new concerns. So here's some copyright basics. These are highlights of copyright law, which hasn't changed in recent years, but with the emergence of the internet, as I mentioned, we have to be more aware of what we're doing and who it might impact. So generally, copyright endures for the life of the author, plus 70 years after the author's death. However, just because something is of a particular age and the author is no longer with us, its copyright may have been renewed or transferred to someone else. Also, copies are material objects in which a work is fixed. That means if you just have an idea about a work, but you haven't translated that idea into some tangible media, whether it's physical or digital, that work isn't truly fixed. But once there is an expression of it, it's fixed in time. So a work is created and protected when it's fixed in a copy for the first time. And here's something I wasn't aware of. When I started working on this and thought I understood most of what I needed to know about copyright, this was a surprise to me. If a work exists in different versions, each version is a separate work from a copyright standpoint. So examples of work would include literary, musical, graphic, audiovisual, sound recordings, and some others that emerge depending on the media. Exclusive rights may not extend to copies for things like backup purposes, meaning you're allowed to make a backup copy of something that you may have purchased or have legal rights to access. And you can make another copy strictly for backup and your own direct access. It doesn't mean someone else should be allowed to have access to that item. Also, registration with the US Copyright Office isn't required for you to be protected for your own intellectual properties. But if you have a significant work, it will offer advantages if it comes to litigation to protect your rights. Another thing I didn't realize until I got into more depth here is that fair use is determined by guidelines rather than a specific definition. And we'll go over that in more detail in a few minutes. So there's a usage restriction spectrum. It starts out from the least restricted, which is public domain. If anything is in public domain, it's open use. You can do whatever you like with it, including using it in a for-profit endeavor. Then there are increasingly restricted rights granted through something called a Creative Commons license. And sometimes a work may have these kinds of restrictions, but may not necessarily be specifically registered through Creative Commons or marked in this way, but you should check the restrictions that the author may have placed on that work. So there may be open use, but with limitations in what you're allowed to do with something that's licensed for you to use, but not necessarily to be able to do whatever you want. And then finally, the most restricted is all rights reserved. And there you will probably need to have permissions by the author or the copyright owner. Fair use may apply here for educational purposes, but you will need to check the guidelines before you feel comfortable using it, even in an educational setting. So in Creative Commons, here's a really handy table to keep in mind. And when you look at something online, you will probably see if something is licensed through Creative Commons, one of these abbreviations. Creative Commons by, and then various levels of restrictions. Of course, if something's in the public domain, you can do whatever you like with it. You don't even have to necessarily cite the original author. With Creative Commons that has no other restriction other than attribution, you again can do whatever you like as long as you give proper credit to the owner of the work. Then you can use Creative Commons material for commercial use depending on how the license is issued. Sometimes you're also allowed to modify and adapt a work, especially for educational materials. You might be allowed to copy that material, incorporate it into a class that you're teaching, and adapt it as needed for that particular class. For other works, if you are not granted this kind of license, you have to use it exactly as it was created, and you're not allowed to change it in any way. There also might be a restriction on whether or not you can change the licensing. If you use a work that has a restriction on the licensing, if you do something with that work, you may not be allowed to change how you license it for someone else to use that work. So it's really important to check.
The experience, but I did not enjoy it. Like, I guess it's just such a static, I don't know. It wasn't very interesting to work on.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the original part of that question. Or maybe that wasn't something intended for our conversation. Okay, here's a question in chat. Does backup mean we are legally allowed to rip DVDs and Blu-rays that we have purchased as long as we don't let others access them? My understanding is that it's correct. You can make a copy of a DVD or a CD that you have purchased for your own use, as long as that is strictly for replacing material that might have been damaged with like a computer crash or something. But you can't make them accessible to other people without violating. Okay, here's a knowledge check. If I found it online, I can copy and use it, right? Now, our example here is a PDF for a Harvard Business Review article that is accessible through a Google Scholar search. So is it acceptable to download and use it in your class?
Use it.
So Jacqueline says it depends on how you use it. Megan says, I would say yes in this case. Jeremy says, currently there are so many textbooks that are downloaded. How do we know what is safe to pitch for textbook committees? Okay, we'll come back to that question in a moment. Rongzhu says we can link to it to be safe. Simon says, I would say yes, because you are not redistributing it beyond your class. Jerry says, I would need to look at the copyright and do a fair use evaluation if it's not Creative Commons. Okay, so we have a variety of impressions here as to what we might or might not be able to do with this. So let's see what the answer is. No, just because you were able to access it through Google Scholar. If you look at this particular file, you will see that Harvard Business Review granted use of this article for a specific time period in a marketing course. So articles and journals are usually available only to subscribers and those willing to pay for individual copy downloads. So should the professors have stored this in a site open to anyone with internet access? I think it's pretty obvious that that wasn't a good thing to do because it opened this particular product to misuse. But it's also possible that the professors were assuming that people would read the copyright information on the use of this particular file. Also, these professors didn't have permission to use it beyond the time period of a particular course. On the fine print here, it says May 2017 to November 2017. So probably to stay in line with that copyright permission, they should have taken it down off of the internet wherever it was stored so that it would be less open to infringement. So let's continue on with this same article. So your university library subscribes to the Harvard Business Review. Can you use its articles as required readings in your course? So we're getting lots of yeses. Yeah, so far everyone has said yes who has responded in chat. So in a course I was teaching a few years ago, I found some Harvard Business Review articles that would have been perfect for the course, and I was planning on using them. And by coincidence, my university sent out a general email about Harvard Business Review and whether or not we were allowed to use it. Kimberly just said HBR is notoriously restrictive, so I would want to look at the license. And you are right on target, Kimberly, because it would seem that your university has a subscription, therefore you're allowed to use it. Nope, not without specific permission from Harvard Business Review. They will work with educators, but their business model includes a cost per student requirement when using their materials. So magazine, journal, and other material sources might depend on income from subscriptions. So some publishers like HBR will restrict use to protect the income they need for their operations. And Jacqueline says, the college needs to be more careful about what they're offering up. Well, it's okay to have journals available online from your library because students might be using it for research, and that's quite permissible. If HBR is there and a student is allowed to read it for their research, that's fine, but you can't assign it for required reading in your class. Okay, here's our next knowledge check. Are these two images presented correctly according to copyright requirements? No comments yet. So Jerry says yes. George says no. Jeremy says no, it needs the URL. Okay, Sherry says I changed my vote, no. Megan says number 1, yes, number 2, maybe no. Okay, let's go on. Let's see. Jerry says number 2 can't be, all rights reserved and CC by. Simon says, yes, I think I don't have to include a link when using CC licenses. Charlene says no to 1. Okay. Here's our answer. No, both images are not correct. Now, number 1 is presented correctly if it's being viewed in an environment in which the hyperlinks are active. I don't know how well you can see on your screens. The first one says this photo by an unknown author is licensed under Creative Commons by NCSA. So there is a link to a photo source and also a link to the license. On number 2, it says this photo is licensed under CC, but there is no active link here. So while this copyright file is open and you have an active link, number 1 is acceptable, but number 2 is not, because you don't have access to the attribution and the license information. So here's what that looks like. When you see downloaded with your image, the statement about this photo, like this one in the example, by an unknown author is licensed under, and then there's a license link that tells you exactly what the terms of this license includes. Unless these 2 links are active, you haven't presented the critical information. So what you can do in order to avoid infringement when, say, this PowerPoint file, if it were copied and printed, then those links would no longer be active. So what you would need to do to protect the attribution is to make sure you have the URLs for both where the image came from and what the license requirements state. So printing both of those will protect you in any, regardless of the form in which the information is supposed to be available. So knowledge check, true or false? You may use a copyrighted item if it is for educational purposes under fair use. So what are your thoughts about that? We're going to go over this in some detail here, but let's have an initial discussion, and then we may want to have a further discussion on how to determine fair use. Okay, Megan says, need to evaluate on how you use it. I lost the, see, Jerry says you need to evaluate on 4 quadrants. Brenda says not necessarily, there are several criteria. Jason says you may use a certain portion. Jacqueline says fair use is confusing. I totally agree. George says, no, you cannot. Maureen, not always. Simon says it depends on the item. Charlene says, as long as you're not making money on it. Abe says, no, it has to state. Kate says, this is a gray area. If it's a copyrighted full text and you are using a PDF version to save your students some money, no. If it's a graph or a snippet of a video clip, you probably can. Okay, I think the comments so far represent what most of us understand about fair use. Number one, it can be confusing. And number two, we need to learn more before we automatically assume that just because we want to use it for an educational purpose, it truly is fair use. So the definition of fair use is based on a set of considerations. It's not a specific rule. So let's look at what the Copyrights Act says about limitations. Fair use, which would include reproduction in copies or phonorecords or some other media. If you're doing it for, say, writing a book review, criticism of an article, if you're making comments, if you're reporting for news, if you're teaching within a classroom, and so on. It's not infringement of copyright, but that alone doesn't determine whether you have full permission to use it. What's considered, as I think it was Jeremy said, there are 4 areas to consider: the purpose and the character of the use, particularly if it's for a commercial venture or if it's for nonprofit educational purposes. The nature of the copyrighted work itself, the amount and sustainability of the portion you use in relation to the work as a whole. For example, if you were doing a book report on something and sharing that information, it wouldn't be appropriate to copy the whole book and share that with everyone. That's an extreme example, but that's one way to think about it. And this may be, the 4th one may be what is considered most if something goes to litigation, and that's the effect on the use of the potential market and the value of the copyrighted work. And that's why a journal like Harvard Business Review is so tightly restricted. Their income from that product depends on selling subscriptions. And if someone has free use to that, it limits the amount of money they can bring in from their subscription base. So all of these are considered in fair use. And also the fact that a work is unpublished doesn't itself affect a finding of fair use or not. So it's the final finding is made upon consideration of all of the factors mentioned. So back up here for a moment. It's always safest if you're going to use a significant portion of a work to get permission from the copyright owner before you use it. This is especially true if something is going to be used in a I'd say not just for profit, but also an educational setting in which students are paying tuition. Money's involved there. So it would be important to think about whether or not you're taking away from someone's potential income from a work they have created. Our next knowledge check, true or false? If your university library has a digital copy of a book, you may assign it as a textbook in your online course. So this is a situation in which you haven't just found something and you have access to a copy of it and you want to use it in your course. Your library actually has one or more copies of a book available digitally. Okay, you all are becoming very conservative now in your approach. We're getting lots of probably not, depends on the licenses. Knowledge check answer is probably not. You will want to check the permissions information on any book you want to assign for reading in your course. One way to think about this is that a digital library is similar in many respects to a library with physical books on the shelves. If your library only had 2 copies of a textbook or a book you wanted to use as a textbook, you couldn't assign that as required textbook for all the students in your class because they all couldn't use those same 2 copies. And digital copies are similar. There may be restrictions on how a digital book may be used. And that will be usually included on the permissions information in the beginning section of the textbook. And even if a book could be used as a textbook, there may be restrictions on the number of concurrent users and how many users can access the book at a given time. I also, in my own use of a book online in a university library, was restricted to the amount of time I could check that book out. I couldn't just check it out indefinitely. I would only have access to it for a certain number of hours. So Rong Zhu says, I will consult with the librarian, and that's a very good idea. Even if you are able to find the information on the copyright information portion of a book in the beginning sections, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and consult with the librarian to make sure you know whether or not this particular book will work for your situation in your classroom. George says if you will put it on the server, it will not be a good idea for the digital copy. George, I'm not sure if you mean like copying that into your online classroom or just having a link to the library copy. If you have a link to the library copy, those restrictions will automatically be applied as your students are accessing it. But if you were copying it to another location, you may not actually be able to do that. The software may not allow you to copy an entire work. So always a good idea to check and double check to make sure you've thought of everything you need to before having a work assigned as required reading for your students, whether or not it's a whole book or an article or some other work. Okay, true or false? Free services such as ePortfolio sites will store my content safely and not allow it to be distributed in ways not aligned with my primary purpose for using the site. Megan says very false. Jacqueline says no. Lorna says not always. We're getting lots of no's. False, false, false. Yes, I'm assuming some of you may have had some personal experience with this. I was manager of an online graduate program for about 5 years. And it was my responsibility to check out allegations of plagiarism and to also make sure that our students were having their portfolio work protected, or at least make them aware of what the situation might be for them. I was surprised at what the popular sites, one in particular, was doing with our students' work when I started finding the sources of plagiarism. Read the fine print. Is free really a safe choice? So what I have highlighted in yellow here, which I won't read the whole thing, but I'll summarize it for you. Some sites, like this one that many of our students were using for their master's program ePortfolio, says you grant us and our affiliates, not just us, but our affiliates and their successors, a worldwide, non-exclusive, royalty-free, fully paid, transferable, irrevocable, perpetual, and sub-licensable right to use and do whatever they want to do with it. In other words, you're handing them your work and there are absolutely no restrictions forever, and you can't change your mind. Once it's on their site, it's theirs, period. Charlene says, you're not the customer, you are the product. And yes, that can be true. So there's additional fine print here, but basically it says you've given up all rights to your product. So here's an example of what I found when I was doing some research for some of my students' work. I found student, quote unquote, example papers for every course in the graduate program I was managing. And they also turned out to be a major source of plagiarism. And students didn't even have to pay for this service. Here's a little box that shows up. If you do an online search and you come across one of these papers for a course you're taking, you don't have to pay for the service. You'll get this little box that says, you can read this free for 30 days. So you have access to student work for so many courses. And I have one student who actually plagiarized in every course she took in the program. She ended up getting expelled from school with no rights to ever return to a university in that state. But I had no idea before I started looking into the fine print and searching what was actually happening with student work, that their rights would be misused so blatantly and with such sad results. Another knowledge check. I came up with an idea for a new procedure for creating online courses, and I created a course to teach it to instructional design students. I just found that someone else is teaching the same kind of course at another university. Can I sue that university for copyright infringement? Jacqueline says no. Megan says no, it's only an idea at this point. This actually, let's see, Michaela says yes if you have a copy. Megan says depends on what created a course means. I had this kind of question come up in a course that I'm teaching this semester. The students are supposed to come up with an idea and then develop it as their course project. And some of the students were concerned that the idea for their project might be used by another student in the class, not a particular individual, but just the idea that if they shared a concept that someone else might take it and run with it. So Maureen says, is it the same kind, but not the same materials? Abe says, yes, if you copyrighted your materials. Okay, so the answer is, according to copyright law, copyright protection for an original work does not extend to the idea, the procedure, the process, the system, and so on that is expressed in the work. So you can't copyright an idea or a concept. But what is protected is your particular expression of that idea. So Maureen was heading in this direction when she said, well, was this the same kind, but not the same materials? So if someone has the same kind of course, but they didn't use your materials, and whether or not you marked your materials as being copyrighted, you're protected if you haven't specified that they're open, that you've given open permission for use. So if someone does the same kind of thing, but they haven't copied your exact expression of it, then they're not violating your intellectual property. So here's some recommendations for copyright safety. If you want to avoid infringement, don't assume that accessible means permission granted. Number two, check for copyright statements for all materials used in your online courses. Number three, you have to ensure that Creative Commons restrictions and license requirements are followed. And that includes providing the URLs, whether it's an image or a written work or whatever, that you provide the URL information regarding where people can go for proper attribution and license definition. And then if you're in doubt about fair use, then define the usage plans for the material and request permission specifically from the copyright owner. To protect your own work, sign, in other words, make it apparent who you are as an author and owner of a work. And it also is helpful to put a date on the work. Be very specific on any restrictions you want associated with all versions of your work. Let's say you had a good working draft of your work and you didn't restrict that. You didn't say all rights reserved, but on your final version you did. Well, under the copyright law, if the draft was a separate version and you didn't specify it was restricted, you might have problems pursuing litigation with someone who has taken your work and particularly has profited from it. So read the details regarding permissions for your work when entering into a relationship with any service. whether it's for free, like the example I gave you, or even for a service you're paying for. What do the permissions state when you enter into that relationship? Is your work totally protected, or is it available? We have a question in chat, which I'll get to in a moment. Also, if you have a significant work, consider registering it with U.S. Copyright Office. It's not required that you do that in order to have protection of intellectual property, but it will help you significantly in litigation if you have to pursue suing someone to get them to cease using your work without permission. So Maureen is asking, does ADA trump copyright? If material is not accessible when using screen readers, can the material be reformatted for accessibility? Example, a non-readable PDF converted to a readable PDF. And Megan says that's a great point. That's something I'm going to need to research further. Without checking with an author or a copyright owner, I would be hesitant to reformat it for accessibility. One might assume that under fair use, since all you're doing with a work is making it available to someone who should have a right to use it if your other students are using it, I'm guessing that wouldn't necessarily violate fair use restrictions, but I'd want to check to be certain. So here are some references that you might find useful. You can read copyright law at the U.S. Copyright Office website. It's copyright.gov. Creative Commons license information can be found at creativecommons.org. And there's a great article available from Harvard University Office of the General Counsel that explains copyright and fair use. They have really good discussions of key issues in copyright and what is considered fair use. You would probably find that easier to understand than reading through the entire copyright law and making sure you understand what all of the how all of the language applies in your situation. So Jerry says our accessibility office captions videos for specific classes and makes those copies available. They consider it acceptable under fair use. And Maureen is asking, is that a caption or a transcript? Captions. Okay, any other questions or comments? Thank you all. This has been a good discussion, and I appreciate all of the participation. Megan says, we use a tool at our university called EULA. It allows instructors to import videos from YouTube, but they have to verify it is in accordance with the TEACH Act. Chris wants to know if this presentation will be available to rewatch online. I'll let Bob comment further on that, but my understanding is that it will be available in recorded sessions in the library.
You are correct. Hopefully within an hour after the last session of today, I'll have that available, and you'll see in the schedule the link has changed from join session to view recording. Oh, and we did have a question earlier about if you were going to make your PowerPoint deck available. Up to you.
I will be happy to do that.
You can send it to
Probably,
me,
okay,
and I'll put it on the schedule on where your title is. You'll see linked into PowerPoint, like I've done with some other sessions already.
okay. Jeremy has a question for me here that I don't know if it's showing up on the screen or not. I tried to make a copy so it wouldn't go off.
Yeah, looks good.
Currently, there are so many textbooks that are downloadable and free online, but those sites are pirated. How do we know which is safe to pitch for textbook committees to consider for online resources? We can't direct students to these sites, but students still figure out how to find them, and the bookstore becomes an afterthought. If I found a book online, I would first look at the copyright page in the beginning of the book and see what it says. And then I would just do some search on the sites themselves to see what kind of reviews are out there, or someone has come up against a problem with these sites. Well, thank you all very much. And Bob, do you have any final words?
And thank you, Linda. I appreciate it. Hopefully, nobody's going to end up in jail because of what you've learned today. So, now, at least in the Central Time Zone, it is just about lunchtime. So we have a break, and then hopefully I'll see you all in roughly about an hour for the first of the afternoon sessions.